very recently published what is widely acknowledged as one of the best books on India in general, I think, perhaps. Why don't you just lay out that thesis, right? Because I think it's a fantastic thesis.
We have many things to be proud of. We also suffer very fundamental challenges, right? In the delivery of basic education, we've got 50% of kids complete primary school in rural India without being able to read. We've got 35% of children are stunted. We have 13 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world, okay? So, and all of these issues are not just about quality of life, they also affect productivity, right? The path to accelerated growth for India is being limited in every way by weak governance in the delivery of essential public goods and services. So most of our public discourse focuses on the top line of budget allocation across sectors, but not on the bottom line of how that allocation translates to outcomes. And because your pipes in your public systems are so inefficient that the returns to paying attention to and fixing those pipes is so much larger that that's where we need to be paying our attention. State capacity sounds like this big black box, but what I'm doing here is doing what Devesh Kapoor says, looking at the state as an organization and not just as an institution, and unpacking the state and saying here are concrete things we can do on data and outcome measurement, on public personnel management, on public finances, on federalism and decentralization, on how do you better interact and leverage the market.
Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm very pleased to have with us on another edition of Fed Dialogues Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor Chair of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. He is also the co-founder of the Center for Effective Governance in Indian States, which is a philanthropic organization trying to fix, improve, transform governance at the state level in India. And Alex Tabarrok refers to him as the most important economist in the world today. That's because he's written this fantastic book, I have it here with me, Accelerating India's Development. And in the book he covers a lot of ground, a lot of which we will cover in our conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. Hi Karthik, thank you and welcome for joining us on another episode of Fed Dialogues. Great to have you here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, let's jump right in, right? So one question that I ask many people is, what was your own personal connection with economic growth, right? How did you come to understand its importance? How did you come to appreciate that there is such a thing? So what was the story of how you came to understand economic growth?
Yeah, so I think, my journey to economic growth is the same as my journey to economics itself, okay? So which is, I'm a child of liberalization. I was born in 75, turned 16 in 91, and, just kind of fell in love with economics, just kind of seeing what was happening. And then the pivotal event in my life was getting a scholarship to go to Singapore. And so I went to Singapore end of 91 and did my 11th and 12th, completed my high school there. And the dominant thought when you reach there is this was a place that was poorer than India in 1965, and 25 years of sensible policies had just transformed the country, and the key to that was obviously economic growth, right? And so it was economic growth just made everything possible in terms of improving people's lives, improving quality of public infrastructure, quality of public facilities, and all of that was driven by growth. And so in my A-levels there, we were partly studying the Singapore economy, so that also kind of reinforced that. And I think, so in a way, there's this famous quote by Bob Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in 95, right, in his 88 paper on the mechanics of economic development, where he says, once you start thinking about the differences in income, you can't think about anything else. And so effectively, I was living that quote in my head before I had ever read the paper, because I saw Singapore, I remember, and I was like, how can, this is the most important thing. And since then, I've been hooked onto economics.
That's fantastic, right? Because I see the parallels in my own story. 1991, I didn't go to Singapore, but I saw India, right? And just the stark transformation that happened. And it's so interesting to see that something similar happened for you. And that Bob Lucas quote is great. I use it whenever I can. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So now you've also very recently published what is widely acknowledged as one of the best books on India in general, I think, perhaps, but certainly on the Indian state and the Indian economy and how they intersect. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book? Just broad strokes, but again, feel free to dive deeper as much as you like.
Yeah, and I think, the book reflects a synthesis of a 30-year journey of research and learning and thinking about, these issues, right? The motivation for studying economics was about, from the beginning, what are the actions a government can take that can improve the lives of its people, and growth is obviously one key lever to that. Now, in terms, a little bit of a slightly longer backstory, right? But in terms of the topics I have focused on, they've actually not been growth, okay? So my focus has been much more on public service delivery and effectiveness of the public sector. So in my undergrad years, I was influenced by Amartya Sen, and so the centrality of human development, of education and health in empowering people to live meaningful lives was kind of a pretty important influence in my life. But I think the other thing I got from Singapore, which is many academics don't have, is a very healthy respect for the private sector and a very pragmatic approach to problem solving, which is, I think, a kind of a marker of the Singaporean way. Okay, and so one of the things I'd also done before my PhD was go to the private sector for a couple of years, and so which means that a lot of my focus, even though it was motivated by goals of justice and equity and human development, I was also very conscious of the importance of effectiveness, cost effectiveness, efficiency, just using your limited resources well. And so the bulk of my research over the past 20 years has focused on improving the effectiveness of public expenditure in the delivery of core public goods and services, right? So most of my work started in education, which is what I'm still best known for. But over time, I've done a bunch of work on health, on child development, and the delivery of welfare programs. And so the reason for writing this book is that over 20, 25 years of work, you learn so much that kind of doesn't make its way into the individual published academic paper. And there is kind of enough knowledge that you want to synthesize. And so it felt like the right time to do it. So I think, but in writing the book, I think it's expanded because I think the one challenge with the book is that it looks scary in terms of size. But the good news is people who start reading it will confirm that it's a very easy read.
Okay? I can confirm that.
So
I've read it twice now, and you can go through it like a breeze. Really.
So, no, exactly, right? And so I think in then writing it, and also partly reflecting my teaching on the Indian economy, you kind of realize that you can't make sense of the Indian economy without making sense of the nature of Indian politics. And kind of there's issues, there's history, there's colonial legacies, there is the nature of the Indian state and what it was set up to do. So I think the book, therefore, has expanded into a broader synthesis of kind of, that's economics at its core, but reflects insights from political science, from sociology, from management, from psychology. So it's become a much broader intellectual project. Any author, any artist, you do the best. And I think the thing I am most happy about is that I am happy with the output, okay? So as an artist, that's the only thing, you can ask for, right? And then whether the audience appreciates it or not is not in your control.
There's a lot of audience appreciation, right? I think everyone really loves the book. There's no end of praise for it. But I think this is a fantastic sort of background that you've given, right? That you started with public service delivery, but it became a broader synthesis of many different things, right? So why don't you just lay out that thesis, right? Because I think it's a fantastic thesis. It's a very important thesis. So why don't you lay it out in sort of your own way, in your own summary? How do you summarize it for people?
Correct. So, let me almost start by saying why I consider this to be the most important agenda. Okay. So there's two core messages I want to get across. Okay. So the first is when you take stock of the Indian economy itself, right? So we have many things to be proud of. Okay. So we are one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. We have, the democracy, there's the demography, right? There is rapid economic growth, there's macro fiscal stability, and there's the diaspora. So all of these factors have contributed to just India doing, remarkably well. But we also suffer very fundamental challenges, right? In the delivery of basic education, we've got 50% of kids complete primary school in rural India without being able to read. We've got 35% of children are stunted. We have 13 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world. Okay, so and all of these issues are not just about quality of life; they also affect productivity, right? So the point is that the motivation of the book in some ways reflects what Rakesh Mohan, who was one of the architects of the 91 reforms, in 2018 when he wrote a review of 25 years. He said the path to accelerated growth for India is being limited in every way by weak governance in the delivery of essential public goods and services. Okay, so one way to kind of tell the story of the Indian economy is that we've got a top 10% that drive the economy, okay, with high productivity, high wage jobs, okay, and with succeeding businesses. You've got another 30 to 40% who essentially provide services to the demand created by the top 10%. So And to give you a sense of that, if you're in urban India and if you employ domestic help who you're paying 15 to 20,000 rupees a month, that is already a wage and income at the top 20% of the India's income distribution. Okay, and then you've got a bottom 50% who are essentially left out. Okay, and primarily in rural India, but who kind of don't have the education, don't have the skills, don't have the networks, and are not connected to be active participants in the India growth story. And that is a population that is kind of heavily dependent on government welfare programs, and which becomes especially salient at the time of voting. Okay. Now, overall, this is a model that has served us reasonably well. Okay, the good news is 10% is for India, still 140 million people. Okay, so that's a large enough population to be dynamic in terms of innovation, in new businesses, startups, being able to staff global capability centers. So there's a lot to be proud of, right? Because 140 million is a lot of people, and that's kind of why we have the momentum we have. Okay, so but we'll do 6-7% to write this. But the question is, if you want to fire on all cylinders to get to the next level, you can't get to the full potential if half your population is not actively contributing to the India growth story, right? So simply put, to get to full potential, that 50% who are primarily seen today as labharthis, who are the kind of, which connotes a passive recipient of government welfare.
The beneficiary.
Right? The beneficiary, right? I mean, which is, of course, the English version of labharthi, right? And you want to convert the labharthi into purusharthi, right? Which is the English and the Hindi version of saying that kind of, now everybody works hard, okay? This is not to say, because purusharth refers to work, right? So it's not that people are not working hard, but they are not equipped with the skills and the human development and the enabling conditions to be able to lift themselves out, right? Like in poverty. So the point, therefore, is that it is not that we don't spend. Okay, so that's one key point. Okay, so one key message of the book is that you really have to kind of invest in making sure that the bottom 50% of the socioeconomic distribution is able to actively contribute to the growth story and also contribute to their own growth. Now, that's the easy part. The difficult part is how, okay? And so normally, like the default discourse from the social sector will say, oh, we need to increase the budget, okay? So education folks will say we need 6% of GDP. Health folks will say we need 3%, okay? Now, there's two problems with that approach. The first is we don't have the money, okay? So the norm of 6% of GDP on education comes from high-income OECD countries that have tax to GDP ratios of 35%. In India, we're at 17 to 18%. So relative to the share of budget, we're actually spending reasonable amounts, okay? So first, we don't have the money because the tax to GDP ratio is half, okay? Second is what we've learned from a large body of evidence of the last 20 years, and this is a key reason for writing the book, is that most of our government as usual spending is incredibly ineffective, okay, in terms of translating the spending into outcomes. And so the unifying theme of kind of high quality research, a lot of it my own over the past 20 years, has been that investing in better governance is often 10 times more cost effective than simply spending more money on programs in a business as usual way. Okay, so the core message, therefore, of the book is that rather than kind of most of our public discourse focuses on the top line of budget allocation across sectors, but not on the bottom line of how that allocation translates to outcomes. Right. And because your pipes in your public systems are so inefficient that the returns to paying attention to and fixing those pipes is so much larger that that's where we need to be paying our attention. Okay, so that's kind of, and then the reason this is a 600-page book, the 800 pages is because it's 200 pages of notes and references. Okay, so it's only a 600-page book and it's an easy read. But because we're talking about redesigning, re-architecting the entire Indian state, right? And then kind of that being the key to accelerating all aspects of development. So that's kind of the core thesis of the book. And then, the reason it is ambitious, it's 18 chapters, right? So, the intro chapter sets out kind of the broader argument of the book and makes the central point of state capacity. Right. And then there are these two chapters called The Politician's Predicament and The Bureaucracy's Burden that talk about the incentives and constraints of the key actors of the state. And I think most citizens don't quite understand, because citizens can see that government is not working, services are not working, and they're frustrated. You blame corruption, you blame, a whole bunch of things. But this is a way of educating citizens about what the true constraints are without focusing on personalities, but focusing on systems. Okay?
Systems and incentives.
It is systems, incentives, and constraints, right? And so then you've got the first half of the book, so it could be two books, but the reason it's not two is the two halves are deeply interconnected, right? So the first half then is about how do you build more effective public systems. And the good news here is that state capacity sounds like this big black box. But what I'm doing here is doing what Devesh Kapoor says, looking at the state as an organization and not just as an institution, and unpacking the state and saying here are concrete things we can do on data and outcome measurement, on public personnel management, on public finances, on federal federalism and decentralization on how do you better interact and leverage the market. So these are core conceptual areas where we've learned a lot over the past 20 years. And a key goal of the book in some ways is that there is so much high quality research, right, that has not been reflected in public understanding. And so that's why the book, each chapter is what I call half social science and half systems engineering, where the first half is let's understand complex facts and the research and understand why they are the way they are. And once you understand that, how can we use that understanding to then improve the outcomes? And that's the second half of each chapter. So that's the first half of the book. And then the second half then takes that to what I consider the critical sectors that we need to focus on. Right. So, there's education and skills, there's health and nutrition, there's police and public safety, and courts and justice. And that was originally one chapter, but it's really about rule of law, okay? Yeah. And that which is absolutely central to kind of economic growth. And then there's a chapter on social protection and welfare. And then comes the chapter that we're going to focus on today, which is the jobs, productivity, and economic growth, right? Yes. I mean, which really is the engine that's going to drive everything forward. Yeah. But the reason it comes at the end is because the book is focusing on government actions, okay? Yeah. So what is actually directly in the government's control is getting the basic service delivery right, getting rule of law right, and getting the structure of welfare programs right. Yeah. Most of the jobs are going to be created in the private sector. Okay, so that's a very different kind of way of thinking. Absolutely. And that's why it comes at the end to say, okay, we've got these enabling factors, but what are the things and enabling conditions we need to do to accelerate kind of job creation and growth?
And often, like in the latter half, it's more that you want the government to get out of the way rather than to do better.
Exactly. Or kind of intervene in very kind of sophisticated ways and be very conscious that more often than not, intervention will make things worse. Right. Okay? And I think that's kind of it's not an easy message. Yeah. But in a way, you could argue one criticism of the book is that because it's focusing on state capacity and public actions, it may give an impression that I'm very statist and everything. Yeah. I think by focusing on what I want the government to do, I'm sending a strong implicit message of what it should not do. Right? But I think the point about what the government should not do is implicit in a couple of places when I talk in the public finance chapter of estimating the return on investment of what you're doing. Right. But maybe that's something I could have made even more explicit. Yeah. But that's
we were discussing a little while ago that the first time you define public goods is in the health chapter, right? And we focus on the public goods. In health, for instance, you say very clearly that public goods is where the greatest return on investment clearly lies, and that's where you should focus on. So I think you make the point more explicit than you make it.
I think the other thing about the book, which is I think important to kind of highlight in India's policy discourse, is that most of our policy. So let me say two more things. Okay, so one. Conceptually, a key contribution of the book is to also move the discourse on development itself. Okay, so one of the grand debates in development for the past 50 years has been what we call the growth versus development debate, or the Bhagavati versus Sen debate. Okay, so basically every human development outcome you look at, education, health, is positively correlated with GDP per capita. Okay, so one view is to say that the single most important thing we need to focus on is growth. Okay, you get more growth, everything else will take care of itself, right? But that's the Bhagavati Panagariya view, right? But then you get the Sen and Dres view, which has been to say that the point of development is not to just boost GDP per capita. The point of development is to enhance human capabilities. And the key point they make is by looking at positive outliers like Cuba or Vietnam or Kerala, they'll say you don't have to wait to get rich to get developed. You can get there by focusing more on the social sector, focusing more on equity. Now, so effectively, at some level, they're both right, okay? Because clearly more growth helps human development and more human development helps growth, okay? So the point then is, why are we arguing, okay? In practice, this argument ends up being ideological, right? Where the center right focuses more on growth and saying, let's get the infrastructure, the capex, and that's what's going to drive us forward. And the center left tends to focus more on the social sector and equity, okay? And I think my key point of departure in this book is to say that this debate is really a zero-sum debate of budget allocation across sectors. Whereas the elephant in the room is that the quality of expenditure is so weak, regardless of what you spend on, okay? So there is huge inefficiencies in our social sector spending and huge inefficiencies in our capital spending. Right. So in capital, again, if you look at kind of falling airports and broken bridges and time and cost overruns, it is not at all clear that just spending more in infrastructure and capex translates into higher quality of spending. Right. And similarly, there's massive inefficiencies going on in the social sector as well. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that by focusing on efficiency, you don't have to be ideological at all, because this is going to help us do more of everything. Okay, sure. And that's why a core goal of the book is to identify an agenda for the country that we can get a broad consensus around, that the left should the left should be excited about building a more effective state because it's going to allow you to deliver basic services better. That's kind of really important for equity and justice because the poor depend on the state, and the problem is that the state is not delivering, right, for what the poor need. Conversely, the right should be excited by improving the efficiency of public spending, and more importantly, that this is what will lay the foundations for long-term growth, because long-term you can't grow without kind of human capital is the key long-term driver of growth. So, and that's why this agenda building a more effective Indian state is something that I think we should be able to build a national consensus around and then get moving. Okay, so that's one. But the second key point I want to highlight is that most of our policy discourse focuses on Delhi and focuses on what the government of India needs to do, forgetting that the vast majority of these issues are with state governments, okay? So constitutionally, education, health, policing, district courts, I mean, they're all with state governments, okay? And even when welfare programs are designed at the center, they're implemented by the state. And when we come to jobs, everything to do with factor markets, land, labor, right? I mean, the permissions, approvals, so all of this thing is with the state government, right? So we really need to be turning our attention to actions at the state level, and hence the title of the book, that it's a state-led roadmap for effective governance, focusing on actions at the state level. And that, I think, has other advantages for India, because by focusing on state-level actions and distributing these menu of ideas, you increase the chances that different states will do different things and learn from each other, and that can accelerate national progress.
1,000 flowers blooming.
Right? So I think, so these are kind of meta points about what the book is trying to do, but like you know, each chapter has enough content to be an entire book in itself. So yeah.
And there is a lot of complexity. I think like it's a really nice sort of unifying theme that you're trying to find, but I think even there, right, you are saying there are things that the state should do and the state shouldn't do, and those are important implicit choices. I think you've certainly picked a lot of things that the state should be doing and doing much, much better. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think for anyone who has interest in these areas, they should definitely read your book, right? I cannot recommend it more highly. Now let me bring you to the sort of second aspect, right? Growth, productivity, what FED is about. But and I think, like you said, what is, and you call it an engine. I sometimes refer to it as a supply side and a demand side, for instance, right? And you need both to really create magic, right? So what is your view on growth, both from a instrumental perspective, but earlier you were referring to it from a moral sense also, right? And I really love that. So just what is your sense? Talk us through that. Tell us what
you know, and I think, see, in general, so if you take a step back and think about the broader evolution of nations and economies, okay? So for 3,000 years, essentially, there was no change in GDP per capita, okay? So if you look at kind of graphs of estimates of GDP per capita, it was an era of what is called extensive growth, okay? Where it's not that there wasn't increase in productivity, but all the increases were absorbed by increase in population, okay? So population increases kept pace with that.
So on a per person basis, everybody was poor.
Okay? Now, kings
lot of equality.
But kings were living better, okay?
Yes, exactly.
Because you had more people to tax, okay? So when we go back and saying India was this great economy in the 15th century or 16th century, like, I mean, yes, the emperors lived better because we had a larger population and there were more people to tax, okay? But because the emperors had more treasure, there was also more incentive for war and plunder. And so 80% of budgets used to be spent on defense, okay? So that's what I call the security state, okay? Like, I mean, for most of human history. And it's only in the 19th century, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, that for the first time, you start getting rapid increases in GDP per capita, okay? And that comes mainly because of massive increases in productivity, okay? So historically, agriculture productivity went up, but went up slowly. But manufacturing is where you got these massive increases, like 30, 40, 50 times increases in productivity. And that's a combination of economies of scale, division of labor, specialization, what Adam Smith has famously documented in the pen factory, okay? So, but then what happens is, this is then also a period of massive increasing inequality, okay? Because when everybody is poor, there's high equality, right? So, but when the growth happens, that growth tends to disproportionately benefit people with physical capital, financial capital, human capital, right? So if you own land, if you have finance, or if you have skills, are the three types of capital, like, you know, that benefit from the growth, okay? And so there's the sense that, okay, like, I mean, so a lot of, when you're poor, when everybody's poor, it's not nearly as stark as when you're poor in the face of wealth, correct? And so a lot of then the misgivings about growth, right, would start emerging in face of that inequality. And then you get the third phase of the state. And it's only in the last 100 years that you get the third phase of the modern welfare state, right? Where then governments step in to say, let's have progressive taxation and kind of use that income to kind of support the poor, okay? Now, the key point to understand is that welfare states are very expensive, and the economic growth in reaching a certain stage of income was then essential to be able to do that. So the key point about growth is that growth is good not just for those who are growing, but over time expands possibilities for everybody. So Harvard economist Ben Friedman has this very nice book that he calls Moral Perspectives in Economic Growth. And one of the key points is that even for people, so let's put it this way, very starkly, right? So somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, who said, think about your actions and do the actions benefit the most underprivileged in society, right? Even for somebody with that view, growth is important, because growth is what expands the moral capability of societies by expanding the resource envelope available to take care of the most vulnerable. Okay, so if you look at high income societies, so think about, the extreme kind of law of the jungle, right? Was the weak wouldn't survive, okay? So one measure of the advance of civilization is our ability to care for the most kind of vulnerable, right? So whether it's kind of care for, special education or disability insurance, so all of these are better in higher income societies because they can afford to do that, okay? So which is why growth is as Deng Xiaoping famously said, to get rich is glorious, right? Because that just allows societies to do much, much more.
One really stark example of this that I sometimes give to people is just animal welfare. Stray dogs in New Delhi, come winter, will have sweaters put on. Right? Some kind soul living nearby will see that they have enough envelope available to them in their life to go out, buy a sweater, put it on a stray dog. Right? Wow. And you go to a village and you immediately see that that's not possible. Right? What makes it possible? It's
income. And speaking of villages, right? One of the most important welfare programs in India in the past 20 years has been the NREGS. Right. And the NREGS was only possible in 2005. That can mean after 15 years of rapid economic growth, after economic liberalization, right? So I think the good news now is I don't think anybody, for the most part, contests the centrality of growth, okay? Everybody wants the growth. The question is how to make it happen, okay? And I think that's the part that's much harder and sometimes requires much more nuanced understanding. So in some ways that chapter 16 was probably the hardest chapter to write in the whole book because other chapters...
That's another strand of literature, not just
because it's like I'm trying to encapsulate all of economics, okay, in one chapter. Correct. Because if I'm talking about education or health, then here is a sector, here is how you deliver, it makes sense. The chapter on jobs, productivity and economic growth is like a crash course in all of economics, right? And absolutely. And the core point is, where does growth come from? It doesn't come from saying, oh, let me attract some investment in some sector. That might be an instrument. But the fundamental source of growth is productivity, right? Meaning that can you produce more with the same amount of resources? Yes. Can one worker produce more? That is the single most important driver of economic growth. Everything else is a means to that underlying principle.
Right. And I had the privilege of reading an earlier draft of the chapter, right? And in that, you had written a very nice, I thought, which you or your editor must have disagreed because it didn't survive in that form, but you had written a very nice form of how markets and prices do this job of allocating factors to higher productivity sectors. And this allocation process or reallocation process is what enables growth over time. Right, and it's there.
No, it's still there. I think it was just kind of tightened, because it had gotten too long. The point is still there. The point is still very much there, right? So again, so let's take a step back for a moment, right? And connect not just growth, because growth feels like some abstract statistic, okay? Let's bring it to jobs, right? Because jobs is what is salient. Jobs is what every citizen viscerally understands they want, and therefore every politician understands, okay? Needs to be delivered, okay? Absolutely. So to make this agenda concrete and politically salient, let's focus on jobs, okay? Now, but once you say jobs and look at the data, you realize that the real problem is not jobs in terms of number of jobs, okay? Because the fraction of people who are truly unemployed is only 5% because poor people can't afford to stay unemployed. So you have to work to survive, okay? So the problem is not unemployment. The problem is that you are working in very low productivity, low wage jobs. And the quality, it's about job quality. Absolutely. So how do we define kind of job quality? Right. So the most basic measure is the wages, okay? So higher wages, higher quality. there is the reliability of the job. Okay, so the same wage, but if it's volatile, right? So when you look at a daily spot wage labor market, like you go to these labor chalks in UP, you will see that there are people who will come and there will be dozens who will go back without a job. Okay, and that means that's a day when you can't potentially feed your family. So these are real human costs. It's not just the job, it's the volatility about do I have the income. And then the third element of job quality is, do I have any kind of safety net within the job where if I'm sick, do I get any sick leave? Do I have maternity leave? Do I have other kind of protections? Because that is part of a social contract we hope that a good job will have, that it's not just a daily transactional, exchange where if the next day you don't show up. So, of course, but then that costs money. So every one of these things are expensive. So the key point is that we want to pay more, we want to provide benefits, we want to provide stability, but the only way to do that on a sustainable basis is if you are adding more value than the cost of providing that benefit.
These benefits, exactly.
So the employer has to be able to generate more value than the cost of employing one person, because otherwise it's not sustainable. Otherwise somebody else is paying for it.
Exactly.
It won't exist.
It won't exist.
And so which means the key is productivity, right? That is the foundation of everything, right? I mean that if you are adding more value, then your employer can afford to pay you more. Now, obviously, in the short term, there will be wedges between productivity and pay. Okay, so one challenge, for example, is it's a very deep economic question. Okay, that when you take a worker from a field and move him or her to a factory, okay, productivity goes up, but the wage will not go up by as much as productivity, and that's because the wage is somewhere between the value and the cost. Okay, but if there's many other workers, then how much you get depends on how much competition there is for your services. So in the beginning, a lot of the gains of productivity will be absorbed by capital, because that's the scarce factor. But over time, as you bid up the price of labor, then you will increase the wages as well. Okay, so but the foundation of everything is productivity, and that's something which I don't think our public discourse has fully internalized just yet, right? But the core is productivity. Now, then we can talk about where does productivity come from. Okay, and so. And again, it's basic economics, but it's worth kind of repeating that the key sources of productivity are your own human capital, right? In your education, your skills, an educated worker can get more done. Your physical capital, right? You can plow land faster with a tractor than with a bullock than with a hand plow, okay? And most importantly, it's the management and the technology of the organizational structure within which you are working. Okay? So there's a reason large firms are more productive, and that's because large firms have the scale and have dedicated management functions that allow factors to be used efficiently. And that's where kind of productivity comes from. Okay?
If I was to just expand this circle out with one more, right? It's where you are located and what that ecosystem is, and does that enable this productivity, these firms to come up, etc. And that's where a lot of the frictions exist for us, right?
Yeah, so again, we could easily talk for 5 hours, okay? But given that we have an hour, a little over that, okay, the question is, what are the most important ideas we want to focus on, right? And I think, so once you identify that the key is productivity, okay, then the question is, what are the drivers of productivity, or what are the constraints to productivity?
Correct.
Okay, so at an economy-wide level, one of the key constraints to productivity is what economists call misallocation, okay? Where your factors of production, okay, whether it's land, whether it's capital, whether it's labor,
absolutely,
are they being used in their most productive way?
Absolutely.
And so the key part of this, and so there's a subtle point between productivity and jobs, okay, and that's worth highlighting, because increasing income is not just about producing more. Okay, there's a subtle point, what the economists call the difference between TFPQ and TFPR. Okay, so TFP is total factor productivity, and TFPQ is, am I producing more output?
Correct.
But the problem is, if I produce a lot more output and the demand doesn't grow at the same rate as the output, then the price is going to fall.
Absolutely.
Okay, so which means that simply improving productivity is not enough to get growth if there isn't demand. So you need to produce things that people value. Okay, and the best example of this is, say, rice. Okay, so over time we've increased rice productivity, right? Massively. But people don't eat, you don't eat double just your income goes up once you've reached a certain basic level of caloric need.
In fact, you eat less.
Yeah. Right? And so rice is, it's a classic example of something that has what we call income elasticity less than 1. Okay, so what does the economy need? The economy needs, therefore, for farmers to produce less rice.
Absolutely.
Right? And move away from rice into other things.
Absolutely.
But because that process is disruptive, you often have policies that are designed to protect farmers farmers, right? I mean, with subsidies and procurement and free electricity and all of these subsidies. But what that does is it actually keeps your factors of production in highly suboptimal uses.
Absolutely.
And that hurts both their own incomes and also hurts the overall economy.
Absolutely.
Because you're not allocating your factors of production to their most productive use. So the bottom line, therefore, is that economic growth, where does growth come from? Okay, growth is the aggregation of individual incentives to undertake actions that improve productivity. Okay,
absolutely.
And so if you want to connect the micro to the macro, right? So growth is what we look at. It doesn't come by magic. Okay, it is the aggregation of organic micro processes. Yes. And so the key insight then for policymakers is how do you kind of reduce the frictions in the economy? Okay, so one very important message in all of this is that, see, so much of our policy attempts to get jobs, okay, investments, focuses on trying to attract a few big investors, okay. Now, this is not a bad thing, all right. Because if I get a big investor, like, you know, an Apple or a Foxconn or somebody, then not only are they providing a bunch of jobs, they're creating supply chains, and all of this is good, okay? But the point is that by itself is a very small part of the overall problem, okay? Because even if you create 50,000, 100,000 jobs, we need millions of jobs, okay? And the problem, therefore, is that by focusing on sectors or by focusing on specific anchor investors, it is not that I'm saying don't do that. What I'm saying is that is not enough, because you have to focus on unblocking frictions across the economy. And I'll give you a completely unrelated example, okay, about why do for example, in the courts chapter, okay, like, you know, one of my favorite examples is a recent paper by Manaswini Rao, who's a professor at the University of Delaware. And she did this paper when she was a PhD student at Berkeley, and she's studying the impact of kind of reducing backlogs in courts, okay, and looking at adding a district judge, and every district judge clears an extra 200 cases, okay? But the point is, 70% of these cases are cases of credit and land, okay? But these are then factors of production that are not being productively used when they are under dispute. And when you have, like, you know, a backlog of 30 million cases, that is not just individual plaintiffs who are struggling, that is costing the economy massive amounts of productive assets from being deployed productively because they're stuck in that litigation. So what she shows is that not only do you clear the cases, but the total increase in economic activity is so high that it's 30 times higher than the cost of hiring those judges. And then that brings me back to the state capacity, right? Like, so what are the core functions of the state in enabling economic activity? So one part is, you know, equipping those who are born in, you know, for no kind of moral failure of their own, like, I mean, born in situations of poverty, to equip them with the basic education, health and skills to kind of participate. And the other key is the rule of law. And all of these are areas we have underinvested in, okay? So, yeah, so I think one of my meta points with regard to our job strategy, right, is to focus less on sectors and more on frictions. And by minimizing friction, I'll give you another example of frictions, okay? So, you know, governments try to create credit schemes for MSMEs, okay? But one of the biggest sources of cost, working capital costs, is the government's own unpaid liabilities. So you've got kind of unpaid bills for so long, and your poor vendor then has to kind of get credit to cover that. And the other part of the government is trying to get money from the finance department to run a scheme for providing credit. But a much more direct way of doing that would be to just reduce the frictions, like in these payments.
And there was a particular category of frictions that you hinted at, and we obviously discussed before, which I love, right, is that the frictions you introduce when you're trying to do good, right? The farmer example that you gave, right? Like you're trying to protect the farmer, but you introduce massive frictions in the farmer taking decisions that would actually benefit them and benefit the economy. But you stopped it because you've added these frictions. MSME's example is a fantastic one, because just recently, I don't know if you've heard about this, they introduced a law that mandates that MSMEs must be paid within 45 days of presenting the bill. And obviously what this does is, instead of allowing people to make contracts which suit both parties, people are saying, I'm not going to deal with any MSMEs anymore. I'm just going to switch over to large firms, because there I don't have that constraint, right? So it's just this classic idea of trying to... So just talk a little bit more about that and the examples. You've written lots of examples of this kind of thing in the book.
Yeah, and I think so. One of the key insights in the chapter, which I think is not obvious but worth highlighting, is that the amount of intersectoral linkages, right? I mean, and so much of our perversity happens because of the excessive siloing of government and excessive siloing of our discourse, okay? So, and And much of our pathologies in economic efficiency come from the fact that we are trying to protect workers from vulnerability in the economy. But instead of protecting workers, we try to protect jobs, okay? And which is where the fundamental source of misallocation comes, because economies are dynamic creatures. Right. Companies will come, companies will go. Sectors will come, sectors will go. And that reflects changes in both technology and tastes, okay? So one way to see this is if you look at kind of the top 10 listed companies in the US kind of stock exchange, highest market cap, I think none of them or only one of them existed 50 years ago. Okay, I think if you look at the top 50, less than 20%. Okay, and that speaks to what Schumpeter famously called creative destruction, right? And that's how economies stay dynamic. Now, with the more specific case in India, okay, let's think about the spillovers from our electricity policy, okay, where you're trying to say we want to provide free electricity to farmers or subsidize electricity to some segments of the population. But historically, governments have tried to cover that by overcharging industrial use. Right. But what does that do? That makes your industry less competitive, and then that means you're not creating the jobs, which if you created the jobs, you may not have needed the subsidy in the first place. So that's an example of these intersectoral linkages. Another example is what we talked about, which is the structure of our kind of welfare programs, where we're trying to do farmer support. But you want to support the farmer, but you end up supporting farming, which, and not only farming, but highly inefficient farming, right? So a large fraction of our small farms would not be viable without the structure of the subsidies, which means that we are kind of destroying value, okay? A large fraction of Indian small holding agriculture destroys value because it produces less output than the unsubsidized cost of the inputs, okay? But if you are able to kind of reform the structure, so I'm not saying we don't spend on farmer welfare, you should absolutely spend it, right? But if you can reform that to kind of income support or support in ways that is not linked to continuing inefficient activity, that is a way in which you actually unlock productivity. Now, but let me give you a completely different example, okay? Because the problem is politically, however sensible these ideas may be economically, politically they are much harder, okay? So let's focus on what I think politically is more feasible and which is, I think, a cross-cutting driver of productivity, okay? And that is urbanization, right? So coming back to misallocation and distortion, right? One of the easiest ways to improve productivity and overall growth is to actually follow an urbanization agenda, okay? Now, why are urban areas more productive? So in any cross-section in the country, you'll see that average wages in urban areas are significantly higher, okay? That means they must be more productive. Now, why are they more productive? So the key then is that because urban areas have much higher population density, that means you have higher demand. So if you have higher demand, you can have more economies of scale. You can have more division of labor and specializing. So you can have like a pav bhaji seller who specializes in making pav bhaji because in a high density urban area, there will be 500 customers and make that viable. That guy cannot be viable in a low density rural area.
Absolutely.
Okay. So high population density gives you the demand that allows kind of the economies of scale to increase productivity, because the per unit productivity is higher when you make 400 than when you make 50. Okay. So one source of productivity is scale. The other source of productivity is the differentiation. Okay. The third source of productivity is that there is more competition, because when you have high density, there is just more choice and competition.
You have to get better at what
you have to get better, and so that forces kind of people to improve, right? The fourth source of efficiency is it reduces the transaction cost, which is related to, so there's a competition side, but there's also the collaboration side, okay, which is in creative sectors, you need to work with other people, meet other people. So high density areas do more of that. So this is kind of why Harvard urban economist Ed Glaeser is called the city mankind's greatest invention, because not only is it good for productivity, it turns out that it's also good for environment. Okay, so a lot of people look at high density urban areas and saying, oh, you have these slums, you have sewage, you have this thing. But per footprint, the carbon footprint and energy footprint per person is actually much lower in urban areas. Okay, so in general, an urbanization strategy would independently be one of our most effective growth strategies. But we have so many policies that actually inhibit urbanization. And because the way our urban governance is structured is it's structured in a way that doesn't recognize. So I'll give you an example. An urban housing department, will think of its job as saying, I need to build low-cost housing, okay, for people who are squatting in slums, right? But the much more effective way of supporting the urban agenda would be to say, how do I encourage large volumes of low-cost rental housing that allows and makes it easier for people to migrate into cities and get that foothold, right? Into higher productivity jobs.
Actually, the general town planner in India thinks of their job to prevent something like this.
Exactly, right? Because, and so everybody is like, because the problem is the existing urban elite wants to reduce migration because they see this as crowding into their kind of spaces. Yeah. But if you think about it from an economic growth, or they say, oh, look at these conditions in the slums and people are living in such unsanitary conditions, aren't they better off in the village? But think about it, the fact that they're still willing to migrate, tells you how much kind of better off their economic opportunities are in urban areas, okay? So, thinking about kind of therefore creating the conditions that increase kind of population densities and agglomeration. Now, the one thing I'm willing to kind of concede is that it's not obvious that the economies of scale keeps on beyond a certain population threshold, okay? So you may hit diseconomies of scale, and so we may need to invest in our tier 2, tier 3 cities.
Although
and create
Tokyo
more
is
distributed.
80 million people and NCR is 30-40 million people. So,
but there may still be a case for kind of more spatially distributed development given India's population density, okay? So for example, Tamil Nadu say does much better than Karnataka on that dimension because the development and urban development, you've got so many distributed clusters, right? That it makes it possible to get a lot of these agglomeration externalities without kind of the diseconomies of scale that come perhaps from the fact that we don't have quality urban management to handle those kind of scales.
The urban governance itself is not
is a separate issue. But the point I'm making is that the urban agenda should not just be seen as something that is an agenda of the urban ministry. Right. It needs to be a top priority for chief ministers and prime ministers because it is one of the biggest drivers of productivity and growth.
So this is a little bit of a segue which was not really planned, but urbanization typically also happens in a very organic way because there is some local economic demand supply gap that is being met in that particular geographic node, right? New York is a famous example. They built a canal in from the lakes is when that agglomeration really jumped off because there's a lot of economic activity happening there, and that node is what the urbanization happens around, right? So the economic engine driving the urbanization. Shenzhen, classic example, right? Fishing village, you turn it into an SEZ, which is another example that you give here. And that really just springs up a city out of nowhere. Singapore, classic urban example of, you build an economic engine, you build sort of export-oriented industry, and then the urban agglomeration really takes off. So what's your view on something like that?
So there are two parts of this, right? So one is, yes, obviously kind of sustainable urban engines of, have areas of economic comparative advantage that they manage to specialize in. Right. Historically, a lot of great cities were built at the intersection of transport roads, okay? Yes. Because it was really trade and being at the intersection of waterways or, ports. There's a reason that's where kind of the big cities historically happen, okay? Right. Now, I think in India right now, obviously there is clearly clusters, whether it's IT or finance or whatever, right? But more generally, I think that the nature of quality of life in urban areas, right, because again of these economies of scale, agglomeration externalities that I talked about, is that as you get economic growth, people just want to move. Now, the other thing, sometimes it is migration, so sometimes it is, we say there's economic activity and people move. But in other cases, it is just the rural distress, right? So I think if you look at, so Anirudh Krishna has done kind of work over time looking at poverty dynamics, right? So I remember him telling me once, he started kind of wanting to study poverty dynamics by starting with a sample of rural households. But over time, it became a study of urbanization because the most important pathway out of poverty was to get one person in an urban area, who then gets a foothold in the urban area and then, starts kind of increasing their incomes, right? So I don't think, while it is true that if you have a specific industry that anchors kind of the demand in a city that can help, I don't think that's strictly necessary.
Sure.
But I think what may help, and going back to where the public goods matter, is thinking about urban planning, whereas I think you were alluding to this, that most kind of city planners and urban planners think about this more from the perspective of structures than people. Okay? Right. So if you think about the goal of the urban area, I think I'm blanking on the names. I think Alan Batraw, there are these principles, right, where you say the way you plan urban areas is a certain amount of public spaces that needs to be planned, but you then don't plan
everything
the nature
around.
of the
You
economic activity there. You don't try to micromanage. Let markets take care of that. But
Bimal Patel is a famous advocate of this view.
Right, exactly, right, and I think he himself was kind of inspired by Batraw. So I think one point here is, I'm just saying that coming back to a government today in India, okay, there's a new government, new agenda. Everybody's desperate for jobs, okay? Everybody wants to figure out what to do on jobs, okay? So I think so let's come back to one. Okay, sorry. Once we think about it that way, then there's many things I can say. Okay? So
let's just finish off the previous one. And then
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was thinking one category of frictions you spoke about is this category that where we're trying to, by doing good for people, we're preventing them from doing what is good for them, right? And that's one. The other one, obviously...
In fact, we can make that even more powerful, right? Think that the nature of your anti-poverty programs is helping kind of keep people stuck in a poverty trap.
Right.
Okay, right, and I think that's something that I don't think people appreciate enough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actions that you take to benefit people are actually keeping them stuck, hurting them, right? And I think it's very important insight, and it comes through very nicely in the book. The other category is just constraints that you put on business, and you refer to this as sort of these multiple binding constraints, etc. Right? So you keep businesses small, a whole host of them. So how do you think about those? And
this is great. And I think, the point is that I spend a lot of time talking about the sources of misallocation. Okay, so we have inefficiencies in labor laws that make it difficult for firms to, because if you can't retrench when business goes down, then you're not going to expand. Because you're like, listen, the nature of being in a competitive economy is sometimes demand goes up, sometimes demand can fall. Sometimes there might be a more productive competitor. So the economy is a dynamic entity, right? So the more the government tries to step in and kind of limits the dynamism of the reallocation of factors, let's take a step back, okay, and understand the magic of the market, okay? The magic of the market is that, you are hungry at night at 1 o'clock and you feel like you want a pizza, right? And somehow that pizza appears. How does that pizza appear, right?
It's crazy.
Right? And it appears because prices are this incredibly powerful signal, okay, that buy. So what does a price do? A price is a summary of what people are willing to pay for, right? And therefore the price magically allocates, because think about it, right? There is scarce restaurant space, okay? So that space could be used for a whole range of activities, right? So how does that particular restaurant
decide?
How does magically that restaurant emerge, okay? It emerges because there is a price signal that says people want this. So, and I tell my students this, right? So you will not see a fine dining sushi place open at 1 a.m., okay? And that's because, fine dining people will go out at normal times, right? And that is expensive. And so you will have that at different times. Whereas it's the pizza store on the university campus that will be open till 3 o'clock because that's what students who are hungry at 2 a.m. will want to eat. Now in India, that might be your Bhilpuri store or whatever. But the point is that the magic of the market, okay, is prices.
Absolutely.
Serve as a signal for how to allocate factors. Okay, and
the best way I've heard it described is by Tyler Cohen and Alex Tabarrok.
That's right. It's a
incentive wrapped
in a signal. Exactly.
Nice.
That's a beautiful characterization. That's exactly right. So the point, therefore, is that every time a government comes and says, this land cannot be reused this way, this labor cannot be reused this way, or credit. Okay. Again, why does kind of a bankruptcy procedure matter so much? Because essentially business activities are risky, and if a lender is not able to recover some value from kind of a failed loan, then you're even less likely to make that loan. So all of these enabling conditions matter enormously. Okay. Now, here is the problem for the politician. Okay, the problem for the politician is every set of reforms is politically costly. Okay, but any individual reform by itself may not be enough. So a politician may be willing to pay the cost of labor reforms if you can show that this resulted in more jobs. Okay? Absolutely. The problem is if I relax labor laws, but I still have all of these other constraints on land, on credit, on other things, that may not be enough to get the visible increase in investment.
So you bear the cost, but you don't get what you're paying for.
Exactly, right? So therefore, this is another version of kind of being stuck in a low-level equilibrium because of these multiple binding constraints, right? So if you really want to unlock economic activity, then you want to think about how do I simultaneously alleviate all of these constraints? And that is what China did so masterfully through their special economic zones. I mean, the whole idea was because these reforms were politically risky, they kind of localized their areas of experimentation and saying, in this special economic zone, we will relax all of these laws, okay? They won't apply to the rest of the country, and let's just see what happens, right? And then what happened?
See what happened.
Right? What happened was that these little kind of enclaves of experimentation ended up being so successful that everybody else wanted to become that way, right? So then, instead of saying, like, I'm going to kind of impose this reform on a political economy that's not ready for it. And there's another Indian example, right? Indian example is, say, BT cotton, okay? Where, again, you've got all of your kind of lobbies who are scaremongering, kind of saying, oh, don't do this, right? And then I think, like, some farmers in Gujarat managed to smuggle it, and use it. And then it was so productive that everybody's clamoring for it, right? So similarly, because there is the fear of the unknown, in fact, it's unrelated to this point, but that's a key reason, a key theme in the book, again and again and again, is why do I focus on state level issues, is that what you need to do for India is de-risk experimentation, okay? So you need to increase the likelihood that there will be new experiments and reduce the risk, because some of them will go wrong, okay? Not every experiment will go right, okay? But similarly, therefore, for a chief minister who's now thinking about what can I do to kind of catalyze the jobs agenda.
Back to 15 minutes ago, like what is the main sort of policy?
So I would say there are 3 or 4 key things. Okay, so one is, think about special economic zones. Like in the past, the problem again is we've tried to do too many of them and they become a real estate play. Okay,
and we don't really alleviate any of the binding
constraints. Don't alleviate the constraints, right? So the point of a special economic zone is not some tax incentive, right? It is really alleviating all of these binding constraints and almost using it as a regulatory sandbox and as a legal sandbox to say, let us see, can we recreate Hong Kong? Can we recreate Shenzhen over here and see what happens? Okay, now that's just one idea. I think a bigger and more important point I want to make is that one of my big concerns today about the jobs agenda, so the investments agenda, is a lot of the competition across states is becoming a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of who can provide bigger incentives. And companies are smart, right? So they're shopping against states. Now the problem with that is A, it's a race to the bottom. B, that money goes straight to capital, who's a shareholder who's typically sitting somewhere else outside the state. And most importantly, that money that's going into the incentive is money that you don't have for investing in your public goods. So a different way of saying this is that the incentive we are paying is a compensation for the poor quality of public goods, which is why you're stuck in this kind of low-level equilibrium, okay? So in an ideal world, what would happen is, imagine a government today was to say, we are going to monitor the time it takes to clear cases in district courts. And then I have a whole bunch of ideas in the courts and justice chapter about ways in which you can speed up that resolution. We're going to invest in more district court judges. We're going to do a bunch of things that speeds up this resolution. We're going to monitor that. And we're going to start attracting investors on the basis of that, right? As opposed to these incentives. The advantage of that is then not only are you attracting individual investors, you're helping everybody in the ecosystem, okay? So, but my larger point therefore is, today the nature of our investment agenda is everybody is chasing the few big shiny guys. Everybody wants Apple, Foxconn, Qualcomm, whatever, right? But there's a few of those. But what about the tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises who are suffering from all of these frictions, okay? So by focusing on frictions as opposed to sectors and marquee investors, you would be focusing your attention on the larger economy and not just your 1 or 2 big guys, okay?
Absolutely.
So that's point number 1. Now, the second point is, of course, these guys will want incentives, okay? And they know that they are marquee investors. They know that they bring supply chains. So they know they can extract certain value, okay? So to the extent that you have to provide incentives, my second key message is, provide the incentives in a way that incentivize labor as opposed to capital, okay? Because fundamentally, we need jobs, okay?
Absolutely.
And all of our policies historically have kind of favored the few skilled rather than the large numbers of unskilled, okay? So in education, we subsidize higher ed, so all of our policies have typically favored elites, and when you incentivize capital, you're doing more of that. So how would you incentivize labor? One practical way of doing this is saying, you, the company, know best what kind of skills you need, okay? So we will give you the skilling subsidies, right? You invest, you will need to bring in your in-house training and train this many workers and employ them. And what we will do is we will cover the cost of that skilling. Right. So that way, you're providing an incentive, but that incentive is going to labor and not capital. And then tomorrow, if that company goes away, then you've still got a skill. That skill is still there, and even better, those skilled workers may go off somewhere else, start new companies, kind of improve productivity in other companies. So focusing on kind of incentivizing labor, I think, would be like a big mindset shift, which some places have started, but not enough, okay?
Even stuff like covering EPFO payments or something.
Exactly. Exactly, right? Exactly.
You already have the system there. You can just...
exactly. So you pay the wage, and it's a wage subsidy,
correct.
right? It's a wage subsidy because...
famously less distortionary than...
and that is quantified. So because one concern is companies will fudge that, right? But if it's EPFO, then you're paying the salary, there's a record, and maybe that's something the government can contribute. Absolutely. Is anybody doing this?
No, they're not.
Why?
I don't know. I don't understand it. But we are proposing it.
Okay.
So, and hopefully somebody will pick it up. But yeah, I think I completely agree. One other idea that you give in your book, right, is that it's not a department's job to drive productivity.
Exactly.
And I love that, right, because it understands the system. And so I want you to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, and I think, see, to be honest, one of the biggest problems today in government is that nobody is responsible for the jobs agenda, okay? And because every department is siloed in its own way, right? So a finance department is looking at, is a proposal affordable, okay? The tax department is monitoring economic activity because they care about tax revenue, but they're not thinking about what they can be doing or how their actions, so they're meeting their revenue targets, okay? Right. But they're not asking about the extent to which their actions on enforcement are deterring investment in economic activity, okay? Right. Similarly, a rural development department will do livelihoods, but they will do rural livelihoods, and they will not consider that the best thing to do is get people out of the rural area. Okay, a labor department is mainly focused on the welfare of existing laborers, as opposed to why there are not enough, why there aren't more workers.
Correct.
Okay?
Exactly.
So the housing department is saying, how do I build more housing and give it to people, as opposed to saying, how do I enable markets for low cost rental housing, because the rental housing in general is way more flexible. Okay. Right. Urban transport departments, like, I think there is still, in my own view, too much fetishization of big metro projects, whereas what generally, like, the first principles of optimal urban design is buses, okay? Like, that's what Ed Glazer keeps saying. Unless you're like 10 million plus, the buses are going to give you way more flexibility.
I think it's some crazy number, like 50 metros in India right now.
Right, like, and so frankly, like, those just don't make sense, okay? And so I think applying kind of a cost effectiveness lens to what are we doing on this agenda, and so coming back to, therefore, every department is siloed into kind of wanting its own pet projects without thinking about what the spillover effects are, right? And I think, so the part I find kind of so depressing is the number of industry departments that are supposed to be about industrialization. The single most important lever is incentives.
Okay? That's like the only lever.
So,
industries departments don't have any other levers.
The lever is, how do I subsidize you, as opposed to how do I promote productivity.
Exactly.
Okay? So productivity doesn't show up on the lexicon. Okay.
Exactly.
And so what I'm calling for, therefore, is just, I couldn't make up a better name, but that literally, like, what I'm calling a JPEG task force, right? Which is the Jobs, Productivity and Economic Growth Task Force, that is anchored by a chief secretary or a development commissioner, that has kind of that it's collecting the right data, okay, is using, say, PLFS or other sources of measurement to have continuous visibility on productivity, okay, and measures of, factors that may inhibit that, and taking this integrated view, okay. And now, one of the ambitious things I propose there is what I'm calling a structural transformation mission, okay, which is identifying that growth is not about finding a few marquee industries, but really kind of accelerating the deeper structural transformation, what Manish Sabharwal says, rural to urban, formal to informal to formal, like casual to contract, and a bunch of these things. And what are the conditions that enable that shift, okay? So, and then a key other part of this, which is not emphasized enough, is the importance of aligning the incentives down the chain of the government, okay? So today, a prime minister can say make in India, a chief minister can say I want growth, but the last mile bureaucrat who has to approve some permission doesn't care if the growth is happening, because he needs his car.
Very funny point.
Okay, so but this is the key, right? So how did China solve this problem? So what we forget about, everybody thinks that China somehow kind of grew with like magical top-down stuff, right? The most important part of the China, in fact, there's this great quote from Stefan Durkheim's book. You talk to Chinese experts, he said, Chinese economic growth was not about economic reforms, it was about governance reforms, okay? So, which again highlights the centrality of governance in our agenda. And the main point was, how do you better align the incentives of the frontline staff with what we're trying to achieve for the economy? And in the Chinese case, the basic point was you had empowered local mayors, okay, who could take decisions about investments and kind of clear these multiple binding constraints together, as opposed to kind of needing to run to 14 departments. And that the reason they did that, because their own kind of career incentives and promotions were linked to kind of measures of economic activity and growth and investments. Now, of course, there was corruption, okay, so like Yuen Yonang famously says. So corruption per se was not the barrier, because sometimes they had some unofficial stakes in these companies. But that made them minority shareholders, right? Like in the overall growth enterprise. They wanted to grow. Okay, now, so I'm not saying in India that we should now start allowing people to be corrupt, but something as simple as saying, do we measure district level GDP, and then do we use that as a KPI for the district collector and the key officials at the district who have the ability to coordinate? Do political parties kind of, because you can now measure GDP at the level of a constituency, does that become a KPI? I mean, think about at the time of elections, the number of MLAs or MPs who are denied tickets, okay, because they're not delivering. And often a party leader has to rely on some highly unscientific surveys here, there, whatever. Now, if you start making economic growth in that area that you measure, make it a KPI for your own party members, it just changes the culture, right? I mean, getting people to start thinking about what do I do to get economic growth, because this is now something that's being monitored. And then you start thinking, wait, this is happening, and you start building a bit of a political voice, right? Like, I mean, for encouraging economic activity. So again, none of these things may happen, but the point about putting these ideas out there is maybe one chief minister will say, I'm commissioning surveys to decide, like, which sitting MLA to give a ticket to. Maybe I can start using some data to measure ongoing performance, and if that becomes a factor in reassigning somebody a ticket, even if it's a small weight, at least somebody is paying attention.
I mean, the lack is certainly felt, right? Like all of these places, they have a lot of states right now have these $1 trillion missions, etc., right? And I sit in some of the rooms where some of these things get decided, and there's a real struggle of data. Right? Like you just don't know what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on, how do you tell people, okay, this is not good enough, do something else? One idea that I've also written on is just, why can't we use GST data more and better? Right? It's just such a direct indicator. It has a lot of the factors of data that you would call as, it comes frequently, it's reliable because it's getting checked at two ends. And we just don't seem to be wanting to use GST data at all to be making economic decisions.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, part of the problem is just, again, lack of state capacity, right? So, because the GST data is considered too sensitive to share with outside analysts, and there isn't enough capacity inside the government to...
They don't share it inside.
No, that's what I'm saying. The tax department holds the data, right? Like,
they don't share it with other departments.
Correct. So, to make it work, what you would need is, kind of an analyst embedded in the tax department, but who works for the chief minister or chief secretary, or somebody who's chairing the JPEG task force.
That actually, I don't think we ever said explicitly, but the point was that you need somebody at the CM level that coordinates across all of these.
That coordinates it, because again, see, the point is, it's not just turf, right? It's because, and this is why I say in the bureaucracy chapter, is that because the bureaucrats are incredibly risk averse, because there's no upside for enabling something. But if something goes wrong and that data leaks, then it's their neck on the line. Okay, so it's the risk reward. There's no upside for initiative, or limited, right? But the downside for something going wrong is so high that it's not, people are not bad. It is systems create perverse incentives. And that's why the whole book is about understanding systemic incentives and constraints, and how that results in individuals acting rationally, but that creates collective dysfunction. Okay? So it's shedding the light on that collective dysfunction to then say, how do you unbottleneck each of these constraints?
I think it does a fantastic job of it. Karthik, I think we're almost out of time. So that was an absolutely amazing conversation, Karthik. I highly encourage everyone to read your book. It's a masterclass. I love it, and I think so will anyone who actually spends the time to read it. Thank you so much for being on. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. My pleasure. And yeah, I guess, it feels like we barely scratched the surface, but that's, I guess, the plea to people to pick up the book and read it.
And maybe we'll have you on again.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you so much.